The Duke of Alderwick did not turn from the window when she came in, and when she had finished saying the thing she had walked 3 miles through the November dark to say, he said it to the 2 gentlemen from the War Office at his shoulder rather than to her. Leave the Ciphers to the Admiralty men, and the shorter of the 2, a sleek official with an inkless, clean, white hand, gave the small closed nod of a man who has been paid the compliment of being agreed with. And Rosamond Clave went on standing in the middle of the great cold study with the copied letter held flat against the front of her cloak until the nodding had finished with her, and there was nothing left in the room worth saying. Then she made her curtsy to the shoulder of a duke who would not give her his face, and she went out, past the footman who kept his eyes on the middle distance, into the raw dark that had not troubled to grow any kinder while she was inside. The study at Alderwick House smelled of sea coal and beeswax, and it was the 3rd week of November, in the year 1815, 5 months after the guns had stopped in the mud, and somewhere in the papers on that duke's own desk lay a letter in a soldier's cipher that was going to hang a name, and the one person within 40 miles who could prove the name innocent had just been shown, very courteously, the door. Mr. Silas Renwick, the Duke's confidential secretary, stood by the fire where the warmth was, and he had not nodded. Quite. He had done something more careful than nodding. He had waited to be sure the Duke would say the thing, and then he had let his face settle into grave agreement, as a man settles a lid onto a box. 11 weeks later, at Candlemas, on the 2nd of February, that same Duke would stand in his own book-room at 2 in the morning with a single candle lifted to a sheet of paper and beg her to tell him a 4th time how she had read it, because he could not make himself believe it, even with the proof lying flat under the flame in front of his eyes. And she would tell him, plainly, in order, the way her father had taught her to break a thing down and build it back, always twice. Because a message read once is only a guess wearing a uniform. But that was Candlemas, and this was Martinmas, and in the dark of that November the study was full of the Duke's certainty and the secretary's patience, and Rosamond Clive was the only creature in the county who could have told either of them that an innocent man was being murdered on paper, and had just been thanked for her trouble and put back out into the cold. She was 25. She had not been raised anywhere near a duke. She had been raised in 3 narrow rooms above a stationer's in a lane behind the General Post Office in London, because her father, Josiah Clave, had for 19 years been one of the quiet men of the deciphering branch, the little sealed office, known to almost nobody, where letters that passed through the secret department were opened, copied, closed again, and read whether they wished to be read or not. Josiah Clave broke ciphers for the crown. He had a gift for it that the great mathematical men who ran the branch never quite understood and always quietly used, a way of feeling the shape of a hidden thing before he could prove it. He had no son. He had said more than once that it was no matter, because Rosamond could hold 4 alphabets in her head at once and turn them against each other faster than any clerk he had ever trained, and he had meant it for praise, and she had taken it for love, which in the 3 rooms above the stationer's came to the same thing. He had taught her, from the time she was 7, the whole secret trade of it, as though it were a set of nursery games, the frequency of letters, the trick of the double, the way a frightened man's hand grows regular and a bold man's grows wild, the patient laying of the possible against the known until the false fell away and the true stood up naked on the page. She had done his work at his elbow for years without a soul outside those 3 rooms knowing a woman's eyes had ever touched a Crown dispatch, and when the peace came and the branch was shrunk, and a winter fever took her father inside a fortnight, she found herself 25 and alone with a trade she could not practice, because it did not exist for women and barely for men, and a head full of the most dangerous skill in England and no honest door to carry it through. That was the winter she had gone for a governess, because a decipherer's daughter who reads Latin and French and Italian and keeps accounts to the farthing can at least teach, and that was how she had come, in the spring of 1815, to the schoolroom at Alderwick, 40 miles from London, to teach the two small daughters of the Duke's widowed sister, Lady Carey, who lived in the west wing of the great house and had neither the health nor the heart to school them herself. So Rosamond Clave had been under the Duke of Alderwick's roof, unregarded, a governess with ink on her second finger, for the whole of that terrible summer of the battle in the mud and the great victory and the long lists of the dead, and then, creeping in behind the bells and the bonfires, came the other thing, the quiet, cancerous, unspeakable thing that came to live in the house like a smell under the floor. The Duke had a brother. Major Lord Christopher Weir, called Kit by everyone who had ever loved him, and a great many had, was the younger son, the laughing one, the soldier. 26 years old and away at the wars since he was 19, and he had been at the battle in the mud, aide to a general, carrying orders across a field that ate horses and men in the same mouthful. And in the September after the victory, when the army was sifting the wreck of the campaign and men were being praised and men were being blamed, a thing had surfaced out of the captured French baggage that should, by every mercy, have stayed lost. A letter, an intercepted letter, taken off a dead French staff officer, written in a British military cipher, giving the disposition and the intended movement of a British brigade on the eve of the battle. The very brigade that had been caught wrong-footed in a sunken lane and cut to pieces before the day was 2 hours old. 400 men dead in a quarter of an hour in a place they should never have been standing. Somebody had told the French where those men would be. The letter proved it. And the cipher was a staff cipher, a key issued to a small handful of officers on that general's staff, and when the horse guards had it read, the hand and the manner of the writing pointed, they said, past any reasonable doubt, at one of that handful, at Major Lord Christopher Weir, who had carried that general's orders, who knew that brigade's ground, and who had, most damning of all, written up the very order that sent those 400 men into the lane. Kit Weir, the laughing brother, stood accused, in the hushed and careful way the army accuses its own gentlemen, of having sold the position of 400 of his countrymen to the enemy for reasons nobody could yet name, and a board of general officers had been appointed to sit upon the matter at Candlemas, and if the board found as the letter invited it to find, then Kit Weir would be shot against a wall, or, if the family's rank bought him the coward's mercy, allowed to shoot himself first, and the name of Weir, and the dukedom of Alderwick, and every living soul who carried a drop of that blood would go down into a darkness no acreage and no title could ever quite light again. And the man who had read the cipher for the family, the man who sat at the Duke's elbow through the whole slow nightmare of it, and told his master gravely, reluctantly, hand on heart, that he had examined the intercept with the greatest care, and could find, God forgive him, no honest way to doubt that it was Lord Christopher's. That man was Mr. Silas Renwick, the Duke's confidential secretary, a smooth and sober and tireless man of 42, who had himself, in the years of the war, been a cipher clerk at the War Office before he took service with the Duke, and who was therefore, in the whole grieving household, the one voice that could speak the black language of keys and columns, and be believed. It is worth stopping on that, because it is the hinge of everything. When a house is struck by a thing it cannot read, a disease, a lawsuit, a debt, a cipher, it does not send for the truth. It sends for the one person who says, calmly, I understand this, leave it with me. And it clings to that person the way a drowning man clings to the thing that is holding him under. Because the alternative is to admit that the floor is water. Silas Renwick was that person at Alderwick. He had come into the house 2 years before the battle with excellent references and a genius for making himself the channel through which everything difficult had to pass. And by the time the intercept surfaced, the Duke of Alderwick no longer knew where his own judgment ended and his secretary's began. So when Renwick read the cipher and pronounced it Kit's, the Duke believed him, the way you believe the surgeon who tells you the leg must come off, with horror and gratitude in the one breath, and grief made him deaf to anything that came after, which was unfortunate, because what came after was a governess. Rosamond Clave had not gone looking for it. She had been in the schoolroom teaching 2 frightened little girls their French verbs while their uncle's house filled up with a doom nobody would explain to the children, and she had heard, as governesses hear everything, the shape of the trouble through doors and from servants and in the swollen red eyes of Lady Carey, who loved her brother Kit the way you love the person who made your childhood bearable. And one gray afternoon in October, tidying the small bookroom where the secretary sometimes set her to copy the girls' lesson sheets, she had seen, left out on the blotter. Because Silas Renwick was a careful man, and careful men make exactly one kind of mistake, which is that they cannot imagine the servant is cleverer than they are. A fair clerk's copy of the intercepted letter, the treason letter, the enciphered lines of it laid out plain for the family's lawyers, with Renwick's own confident reading penciled beneath. And Rosamond Clave, decipherer's daughter, who had broken harder than this at her father's elbow before she was 12, had stood in a duke's bookroom with a lesson sheet in her hand and read the penciled solution, and felt the whole back of her neck go cold, because she knew the way she knew a note was flat before she could have named the string, that the reading was wrong. Not wrong the way a schoolboy is wrong, in a place you can point to. Wrong the way a forged coin is wrong, in the weight of it, in 100 small places at once. Renwick's solution was fluent, confident, internally perfect, every enciphered line resolved into a clean English sentence. The disposition of the brigade, the hour of its march, the sunken lane named outright, and that fluency was the very thing that made the hair rise on her arms, because Rosamond Clave had spent her childhood inside the real thing, and she knew what a genuine field cipher looks like when it is broken. It looks like a man in a hurry and a fright, cramped and clipped and full of the brutal shorthand soldiers use, the dropped articles, the misspelled place names, the numbers run together, a message written by lamplight on a drumhead by somebody who expects to be shot before dawn. Renwick's solution read like none of that. It read like a clean sentence composed at leisure by a man at a warm desk who wanted it understood. Because it was. She could not prove it that afternoon. She copied nothing. She was too much her father's daughter to be caught with a lesson sheet full of treason. She put the paper back exactly as it had lain, squared to the blotter, and she went up to the schoolroom and heard the girls their verbs with her hands not quite steady. And that night, in the narrow governess's room under the eaves, she began to do the only thing she knew how to do, which was to take the thing apart in her head and build it back honestly, and see whether it stood. And over the weeks that followed, stealing an hour here in the bookroom where the copy still lay carelessly out because Renwick never dreamed the danger, working the rest of it from memory in her own room in the dark, Rosamond Clave broke the treason letter herself. from the beginning, trusting nothing of Renwick's. And what she found when it stood up honestly on the page was not what he had, penciled beneath it, and the difference between the two was the whole of an innocent man's life. Because the letter was real. That was the terrible cleverness of it. The enciphered lines were genuine, truly taken off a dead Frenchman, truly written in the staff cipher of that general's small circle. But the message inside them, read honestly, was not a betrayal. It was a warning. Broken clean, in its cramped and frightened soldier's hand, the letter said that the brigade in the sunken lane was mistakenly placed, that the ground was a death trap, that the order sending it there was in error and must be countermanded before dawn, and it was addressed, not to any Frenchman, but to the general's own headquarters, a British officer's desperate midnight attempt to stop the slaughter he could see coming. It had never reached the headquarters. It had been carried by a galloper who was killed, and his satchel rifled by the enemy, and the warning that might have saved 400 men had ended in French baggage instead, unread, until it surfaced in September to be read backwards into its own exact opposite, a warning turned into a betrayal. A man trying to save the brigade turned into the man who sold it, by a fluent. False solution penciled underneath by a careful hand. And when Rosamond had the true reading, cold and complete, she understood two more things in the same breath, and the second of them stopped her heart. The first was that Kitweir had not merely not betrayed the brigade, Kitweir had written the warning. The cramped, frightened midnight hand was his. The letter that damned him was the very letter that, read right, would have made him the one man on that field who tried to stop the murder. And the second thing, the thing that made her sit very still in the dark with her father's whole trade ringing in her ears, was this. The false solution was not a mistake. Nobody breaks a cipher backwards by accident. A man does not resolve a warning into a betrayal through honest error, because the honest error would produce nonsense, not a clean, guilty sentence with the sunken lane named in it. To turn that letter inside out and make it read like treason, and make the treason fluent, and make it point at the one officer who had actually tried to save the day, that took a decipherer. A good one, a man who understood the staff cipher from the inside, who had perhaps even helped devise it, who could take a true warning and forge a false reading so smooth that the great men at the Horse Guards would nod and sign. It took a man who had been a cipher clerk at the War Office in the years of the war. It took Silas Renwick. She did not know yet why. That came later, in pieces, that Renwick was the paid hand of it, that there had been a real traitor on that staff, a well-born officer deep in debt who had genuinely sold positions to the French, and who stood in that September reckoning, one honest inquiry away from the rope, and that this man, or the men who owned his debts, had reached into the Alderwick household through its own secretary and bought the one service that could save the real traitor's neck, a scapegoat, cleanly framed, to lay the whole season's treasons upon, so that the inquiry would close satisfied and look no further. And who better to hang it on than Kitweir, who had actually written the incriminating-looking letter, whose own honest warning could be flipped into his own confession, and whose family conveniently employed the very decipherer being paid to flip it. Renwick had not needed to plant a thing or forge a hand. He had only needed to read a true letter falsely, with authority to the one household that trusted him, and let grief and rank and the army's hunger for a tidy answer do the rest. It was the most elegant murder Rosamond had ever seen, and it was being done in the house where she taught the victims' nieces their French, and she was a governess, and nobody on earth would believe her. She did not go to the Duke first. She wanted the record to show, ever after, that she had not run to the Duke with a story the first hour she suspected it, because she knew exactly how it would look. The clever governess, the decipherer's orphan, the unmarried woman with a head full of dangerous learning and a grievance nobody could name, coming to a grieving Duke to contradict his trusted secretary about the one subject on which she could not possibly have any honest knowledge. A woman of her station was not supposed to be able to read a cipher at all. That she could was the very thing that would be used to damn her. How does a governess come to break a crown military cipher? Unless she is exactly the sort of dangerous, unnatural, untrustworthy creature a careful man would warn you against. So she spent the back end of that autumn making certain, not persuading herself she was already certain, but building the certainty into a thing that could stand outside her own head in the cold and be handled by other men. She broke the letter again, twice more, on paper this time, hidden where even a searching hand would not find it, sewn into the lining of her workbox beneath the wools. And then she did the thing her father had taught her that Renwick, in all his cleverness, had forgotten to guard, because clever men who forge the inside of a thing always forget the outside. She laid the letter against the world. Renwick's false solution lived entirely inside the cipher. It could not be broken from within, because he had built it from within, smooth and closed and perfect. But a true event leaves marks in 100 places its forger does not control, and Rosamond went after every one of them. The letter, read honestly, named a village and a bridge and an hour. She got, out of the published Gazette and the regimental lists any bookseller could furnish, and 2 long, careful letters to a retired quartermaster her father had once done a kindness. The real movements of that brigade on that night, where it truly stood, when it truly marched, which bridge was truly standing, and which had been blown 2 days before, and where the true reading of the letter agreed with the true history of the field, exactly, hour by hour, bridge by bridge. Renwick's fluent false solution contradicted the plain published record in 3 separate places. Because Renwick had forged his guilty sentence to fit the accusation, not the ground, and the ground did not care what the Horse Guards wished to believe. By Christmas she had it whole. The honest decipherment proved 3 times. The true history of the brigade laid beside it out of public print. The 3 places where the official guilty reading collided with facts any officer could check, and, standing up out of all of it like a man, the shape of what Silas Renwick had done and why. She had it in a plain gray memorandum book, cast up in order, the way her father had taught her to build a case so complete that a day would come when it would have to be read whether the clever men wished it or not. And then, and only then, holding a thing she could prove, she had put on her cloak and walked through the November dark to the study door, and asked the footman, trembling, to tell his grace that his sister's governess begged the favor of 3 minutes on the subject of his brother, and the Duke of Alderwick, who had a soldier's grief and a broken man's terror, and a secretary at his elbow, who murmured that the poor young woman had grown strange and fanciful on the subject, and had best be heard kindly and sent away, had listened to perhaps 40 words of it, standing at his window with his back to her, and had said to the War Office men and not to her, "Leave the ciphers to the Admiralty men." And she had made her curtsy to his shoulder and gone out into the cold. It is worth stopping on that too, because it is the commonest cruelty in the world, and not a cruelty at all in the man who does it. The Duke of Alderwick was not stupid, and he was not unkind. He was a man of 32 who had buried his father and half his friends, and now a board of general officers was sharpening a wall for his little brother, and Silas Renwick had spent 2 years being the one calm, competent voice in every disaster. And here was his niece's governess telling him that the calm, competent voice was a liar and the whole shape of the horror upside down. Of course he did not hear her. Hearing her would have meant that the man he leaned on was the hand at his brother's throat, and that he had been, for 2 years, a fool. It is very much easier, when a servant tells you the floor is water, to send the servant away. So he sent her away, and Silas Renwick, by the fire, watching his master's niece's governess make her curtsy to a duke's shoulder and go, understood 2 things in that moment that the duke did not. He understood, from something in the steadiness of her, that she had not come with a fancy. She had come with a solution. And he understood that a decipherer's daughter had somehow got inside his beautiful murder, and that he had until Candlemas to get her out of it, to take her book, or burn it, or break her so thoroughly that no man alive would credit a word she cast up, and that the pleasant, patient, profitable part of his work at Alderwick was over. She walked back to the West Wing that night through the sleeping house, and she did not weep, because she had done her weeping in October over the arithmetic, when the true reading had come up clean for the 3rd time, and she had understood exactly how alone she was going to be in the knowing of it. She had no name, no rank, no witness, and a skill that damned her by its very existence, and she had until Candlemas. So she did the one thing she knew how to do, which was to make the book so complete and so plain that a day would come when it would have to be read whether the clever men wished it or not, and she began, at the same time, to look for a door, some way into the household's belief that Silas Renwick did not hold the key to. She did not yet know what it was, but she knew, the way she knew a column was wrong before she found the error, that the door existed, because clever, thorough, patient men make exactly one mistake: they leave the honest thing lying about, because it never once occurs to them that the honest thing is dangerous. The door, when she found it, was an old woman. There was a dowager at Alderwick, the Duke's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, who had been born in the reign before the last, and had buried a duke and 2 sons, and had not left the house in 9 years, and had, at 81, a mind like a steel trap left out in all weathers, rusted at the hinge and lethal at the jaw. She lived in the south rooms with a companion and a great deal of contempt, and she had frightened 3 generations of her own blood, and the only person in the house that autumn who was not afraid of her was the governess, because Rosamond Clave had been frightened by experts, and an old woman held no terrors for a girl who had broken crown ciphers in the dark. Rosamond had been sent to read to the dowager on the evenings when the companion's chest was bad, and where everyone else read to the old lady as though she were a fractious child, Rosamond read to her as though she were a clever adult, and argued with her about what she read, and lost at chess to her, honestly, and won honestly when she could. And the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, who had spent 9 years being humored, took to the governess the way the parched take to rain. And it was to the dowager, in the end, not to the duke, who would not hear her, but to the one person in the house who was older than the family's fear and past all use for being lied to, that Rosamond Clave told the whole of it. One December night, plainly, in order, out of the gray book, the false reading and the true one, and the warning turned into a betrayal, and the smooth hand that had turned it. The old woman listened to the entire thing without once interrupting, her ringed hands folded on the head of her stick, and at the end she was quiet for a long time, and then she said a thing Rosamond did not expect. "I have watched that man Renwick come up my grandson's stairs for 2 years," she said, "in a coat too good for a clerk, and a manner too humble for a gentleman, and I have thought, that man is measuring us for something. I did not know for what. Now I do. And you have brought me proof, which is more than my contempt ever was. My grandson will not hear you because you are young and a woman and he is drowning and Renwick is the plank across his chest. No, do not defend him to me, child. I have loved that stupid boy since he was an hour old, and he is being a stupid boy. But I will tell you a thing that man does not know I have. And here the old woman smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of 81 years that has finally found a use for itself. Before Kitweir had gone out for the last campaign, she told her the boy had come to say goodbye to his grandmother as he always did, and he had left with her as he always did, half in jest, half because a soldier likes to think something of his will survive him in honest hands, a small locked dispatch box of his private soldiering things, to be kept for him or given to whom she saw fit if he did not come home. And in that box, the old lady said, along with his letters and his mother's miniature, was Kitweir's own field cipher, his personal copy of the staff key, and the worn little notebook in which he had kept and worked it through 3 campaigns in his own cramped, frightened soldier's hand. The genuine article, the true key, from the accused man's own possession, that had sat locked in an old woman's south room all through the season. Silas Renwick was swearing to the horse guards that no honest reading of the intercept could be had. He thinks the boy's key died with the boy, or was lost in the baggage, said the dowager. He has built his beautiful lie on the certainty that nobody outside the horse guards holds the means to check him, and I have been sitting on the means for a 12-month, in a box, under a miniature of my dead daughter, because an old woman's love is a better strong box than any bank. Now, you can read a cipher, you say. Prove it to me. Not to my grandson, to me. Take the boy's own key out of the boy's own box and turn that devil's letter in front of my eyes. And if it comes out a warning, as you say, and not a betrayal, as they say, then you and I, Miss Clave, are going to save this family whether it wishes to be saved or not. So that was the door, and it was a good one, and it held, but it did not hold easily, because Silas Renwick was not a man to be surprised twice. Rosamond knew, her father had drummed it into her, that her own reading, however honest, was worth nothing standing alone, because the board would never take the word of a governess against a certified War Office man. A cipher cannot be counted at a glance the way a stack of coins can, and there lay the whole danger of the thing, that the proof was invisible to everyone who most needed to see it. So the dowager did what the dowager could do that nobody else in the county could. She wrote a letter, in her own spidery, imperious hand, to a man she had known 60 years, Mr. Obadiah Finch, retired chief of the deciphering branch of the General Post Office, the very office in which Josiah Clave had spent his life, a dry, disbelieving, formidable old man who had broken the correspondence of half the courts of Europe and trusted not one living soul. And she required him, as an ancient friend, and on a matter touching the life of her grandson, to come down to Alderwick and examine the work of a young woman he had never met, and tell her honestly whether it was sound or whether it was the fancy of a hysterical girl. And Obadiah Finch, who owed the Dowager Duchess Cordelia a debt of 60 years' standing that this history has no room to tell, came in the 2nd week of January, in a black coat gone green with age, and he shut himself in the Dowager's south room with the intercept and Kitweir's genuine key, and Rosamond's grey book and the published Gazette. And he sent out only for candles and more candles, and he spoke to Rosamond at first, not at all, and then, on the 2nd day, entirely, because on the 2nd day the dry old man had stopped being able to pretend, and what he said when at last he came out to the dowager, had lost every particle of its dryness. "I knew your father, girl," he said to Rosamond, which she had not known, and which went into her like warmth. Josiah Clave was the best natural hand the branch ever had, and the branch never once had the wit to say so to his face, and neither, God forgive me, did I. I have spent 2 days trying to break your reading, because that is my trade, to disbelieve, and I cannot. It is sound. It is better than sound. It is beautiful. You have taken a true letter that a scoundrel turned inside out, and you have turned it right side in again with the man's own key, and it comes out a warning 3 times over. And where it says a thing about the field, the Gazette says the same thing, and where the certified reading says a thing, the field itself calls it a liar. There is no honest doubt in it. And there is one thing more. Madam, turning to the dowager, his old voice gone hard, the thing that hangs your Mr. Renwick and not merely clears your grandson. A false reading proves a lie was told. It does not prove who told it. But the certified solution that went up to the board, I have seen its fair copy among the family's lawyers' papers, is not on War Office paper at all. It is on a common gentleman's hot-pressed wove, and I will lay my 60 years' reputation that if you hold it to a strong light you will find the maker's watermark, and the very same stock upon the writing table of whichever man in this house buys his paper by the ream, for a certified crown decipherment does not get written on the household stationery of a duke, unless it was manufactured in the duke's own house, and there is only one hand here that speaks cipher. And the Dowager Duchess Cordelia sent for a fresh sheet of the house's own writing paper and for the lawyer's file, and held the certified solution up to her candle beside it, and the watermark in the treason paper and the watermark in the household paper were, letter for letter, and date for date, the same. She lowered both sheets and sat very still, an old woman holding the physical proof that the murder of her grandson's name had been written at a desk not 40 feet from her chair, and she said, "Quiet the way a great house goes quiet before a storm. Now we know where the letter came from. And now, Miss Clave, we are going to make my grandson hold it to the light himself, for he will believe his own hand at a candle where he will never believe a governess in a book. But we must be clever about the room, for that man is not beaten yet, and he has 3 weeks to run and everything in the world to lose, and a found-out thief with 3 weeks in hand is the most dangerous animal God makes." She was right about the danger, because Renwick had not been idle. He could not get at the gray book. Rosamond carried it on her person, or locked it where even old Finch did not know it lay, so he did what clever men do when they cannot reach the proof. He went for the person. Because a woman's word in the winter of 1815 was a cheap thing to break, and a clever woman's cheaper still. Word began to move through the county that the new governess in the West Wing was not what she seemed, that she pried, that she had wormed her way into the poor mad old dowager's confidence, that there was something unnatural in a woman who could talk cipher and gazette like a War Office clerk. And did not such knowledge come, when you thought about it, from unnatural places? That grief had turned her head, that the Christian course was to pay her no heed, and, before she did herself or the children a mischief, have her quietly removed somewhere she could be cared for. And Renwick said none of it himself. He only looked grave when her name came up, and sighed, which is the surest way in England to make certain a thing is believed. And the Duke of Alderwick, drowning, half believed it, because it was so much easier than the other thing. That was the fortnight Rosamond Clave learned what it costs to be the small person who is right, that it does not cost you the argument, for she was winning the argument. The gray book grew surer by the day, and old Finch's name now stood behind it. It costs you the ground under your feet, one plank at a time, until you look down and find you are standing on nothing but an old woman's contempt and a dead spy master's respect in your own father's handwriting, while the whole respectable weight of the county leans, gently and regretfully and with the best manners in the world, on the idea that you are mad. What broke it was a candle. The dowager, when Rosamond told her how the county wind was blowing, did not waste an hour on indignation. She sat very still in her black silk and thought. And then she said, "He is winning the whisper, and we cannot unwhisper him. We have not the standing. So we will not fight the whisper. We will show my grandson a thing he can put his own 2 hands on, because Renwick has spent 2 years teaching him to distrust his own judgment and trust the man who reads the papers, and the only cure for that is to make the boy read the paper himself. You cannot count a cipher as you count a fallen wood. But you can turn a key, and you can hold a sheet to a flame, and a man who does those 2 things with his own hands stops needing to be told what they mean." So the Dowager Duchess Cordelia did the thing she had not done in 9 years. She had herself carried down out of the south rooms, to the open astonishment of the entire household, and she did not summon her grandson to her own chamber where he might soothe an old lady and escape. She had herself set up in the great book-room where the family's lawyers kept their papers. At night, with the fire built high and every candle in the room lit. And she sent for the Duke of Alderwick, and for Mr. Obadiah Finch, and for the locked dispatch box out of her south room, and she sent, last, for Silas Renwick, because she wanted the thief in the room when the honest thing was done, so that the Duke could watch his secretary's face while his own hands turned the key. And when they were all assembled in the blaze of that room, the grandmother upright in her chair, the old decipherer dry and terrible beside her, the governess with her gray book, and the smooth secretary standing very still by the door, with the wariness of a cat in a strange house, the dowager laid Kitweir's own dispatch box on the table before her grandson, and said, "Julian, before you say one word, open your brother's box. It has been in my keeping since he kissed me goodbye, and that man by the door does not know it exists, and I want you to see his face when he learns of it." And the Duke, bewildered, opened his brother's box and lifted out the worn little cipher notebook in the cramped familiar hand he had known since they were boys. And across the room Silas Renwick, for the first time in 2 years, went the color of tallow, because the one thing his beautiful murder could not survive was the accused man's own genuine key in an honest hand, and he had staked everything on its being lost, and it was lying on the table in front of the Duke. Then old Finch spoke, dry as a closed drawer. "Your Grace does not have to believe your governess, and you do not have to believe me, and God knows you have been taught these 2 years to believe neither of us. So believe your own hands. Here is the letter the board means to hang your brother on. Here is your brother's own key, out of your brother's own box, that no man in this house but you has touched tonight. Sit down and turn the one with the other, letter by letter, in your own hand, and read out what comes off the page, not what I tell you it says, what it says." And the Duke of Alderwick sat down at his own table in the candle blaze, and under the eyes of an old woman and an old spy master and a governess and a thief, he did the arithmetic himself, slow and clumsy and honest, matching sign to sign out of his brother's notebook, writing the plain letters down as they came, and the room was so silent you could hear the fire and the scratch of a duke's pen. And what came off the page, in his own writing, in his own brother's key, was not a betrayal. It was a warning. It came up under his hand a warning 3 times over. The sunken lane, the death trap, the order that must be countermanded before dawn, the frantic midnight cry of a man trying to save 400 lives, and the Duke read it off the page he had written himself, and his voice got lower and worse as it went, the way a man's voice goes when the floor he has stood on for 2 years turns, under his own eyes, to water. And when he had done, and sat staring at his own honest handwriting, the dowager said, quite gently for her, "There is one thing more. Julian, take up the certified reading, the one they sent to the board, the one that made your brother a traitor. Hold it to the candle. Only that. Hold it to the light and tell the room what you see in the paper." And the Duke picked up the certified solution and held it to the flame. And there in the grain of it, plain as a brand, stood the maker's mark and the year, and it was the mark of the very paper he bought by the ream for his own house. The paper on the table under his own elbow. The paper Silas Renwick wrote on every day at his master's business. And the Duke of Alderwick sat with the 2 sheets in his 2 hands, his brother's honest warning that he had written himself and the certified lie that had been manufactured in his own house, and he understood at last, with his own hands and his own eyes, and no governess to disbelieve, exactly what had been done to his brother, and exactly who had done it. And he turned in his chair and looked for the first time full in the face of the man by the door. Silas Renwick did not bluster and he did not run, because he was too clever for either, and he did the 3rd thing, the cold thing. He said gravely that this was a most painful scene to force upon a grieving family, that the young woman's ingenuity was remarkable and her devotion touching, that decipherment was a subtle art in which honest men differed, that a household's writing paper found its way into 100 hands, and that he was entirely confident the board of general officers, composed of experienced men and not of excitable governesses and aged ladies, would take the certified reading of the proper authorities over the private theories of a West Wing schoolroom. And he made the Duke a small, correct bow, and said he would of course hold himself ready to answer any question his Grace's lawyers cared to put, and he went out of the book-room at an unhurried walk, a man with his forgery lying exposed on the table behind him, moving as though he had all the time and all the right in the world. And Rosamond watched him go, and felt no triumph at all, only the cold, because she understood what the unhurry meant. It meant he still thought he would win. It meant that the book-room had cost him the Duke, and he knew it, and he did not care, because the Duke was not the battlefield. The board was the battlefield. Candlemas was the battlefield, and a notebook in a grandmother's box, and a watermark in a candle, and a governess's honest reading do not, on the day, acquit a man before a board of general officers who have already been handed a certified confession by the proper authorities, and would very much prefer, all of them, that the tidy answer be the true one. What acquits a man is the certified authority itself standing up in the room and saying, before witnesses of weight, we were deceived, and that Silas Renwick was entirely sure could never be made to happen. Because the man who had carried the false reading up to the War Office and vouched for it there, the superintendent of the cipher office who had certified it under his own hand and staked his office on it, was the last man on earth who would ever stand up and confess that his office had been played for a fool by a governess. His name was Mr. Prosper Kell, and Renwick had chosen him with care, because a proud official with his own reputation sewn into the lie is the safest lock a forger ever fits. So the whole of it, after the notebook and the candle and the watermark in the grain of the paper, came down to a single room on a single morning, and to who was made to sit in it, and the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, who had learned in 81 years exactly how proud men are broken, made very sure of the room. She would not have it done quietly in the board's own chamber, among sympathetic soldiers who wanted the season closed. She required that before the board sat at Candlemas, there be held at Alderwick House a private examination of the new evidence, and she summoned to it the president of the board, an upright old general named Sir Hector Malden, who had known Kit Weir's dead father, the family's counsel, Mr. Obadiah Finch, whom no man in England could wave aside, and, because he could not refuse a duke's and a dowager's summons without confessing by his absence, Mr. Prosper Kell himself, superintendent of the cipher office, who came down certain he was to put a hysterical girl and a senile old woman in their place, and walked instead into a reckoning, because when they were assembled, the Dowager Duchess Cordelia did not defer to the general or the superintendent. She rapped the table with a fan that had been to 2 coronations, and she said, "Gentlemen, I am too old for ceremony, and far too old for lies. And a very great one has been told about my grandson, and I have brought you here to watch it undone by the person who undid it, and you will listen, because I am the oldest thing in this house, and older than the dead, and I say you will." And she looked down the table at Rosamond Clave in her plain gray governess's gown, with the notebook and the gray book before her, and she said, "Read it to them, child, plainly in order, the way your father would. And let any man at this table who has called you mad take up the boy's own key and call you mad again to your face, if he can." And Rosamond read them the truth. She stood up at a duke's table and took the intercept apart in front of them with the accused man's own key, sign by sign, and built it back a warning. And she laid the true reading against the published Gazette where the two agreed hour for hour, and against the certified reading where the field itself gave it the lie in 3 places. And she held the certified solution to the candle and showed the grain of it, the maker's mark, the year, the household stock, and she did not raise her voice once, because a cipher does not shout, and a key does not tire, and neither of them cares whose daughter you are. And when Mr. Prosper Kell, gray to the lips, tried to break in, that this was irregular, that a governess had no standing, that the office's certification stood on the honor of the office, old Obadiah Finch rose to his own feet, trembling with age and with something harder than age, and said the thing that was the hinge of the whole morning. "Sit down, Prosper," he said, "for I trained you, and I am ashamed of the training. I have sat 40 years in that office, believing our certifications were the one thing in this kingdom that could not be bought, and this young woman has shown me in an hour that your office set its seal on a lie a paid clerk, cooked in a duke's back room, and that you certified it without once turning the accused man's own key, because it was easier and it was tidy, and the season wanted closing. That is your shame, and it is mine for training you to prize a tidy office over an honest one. But I know it now, and I will not let the branch I gave my life to be the wall a murderer hid behind. I will stand before your board myself, and I will swear to this reading, and I will lay the whole method open. And if the office I love has helped to build a wall for an innocent soldier, then the office will help to pull it down, stone by stone, though it cost us every reputation in it." And he sat down, an old man who had spent his last certainty to buy an honest hour, and Rosamond Clave thought better of him to the end of her life. After that it went quickly, the way a rotten wall goes quickly once the first stone is out. General Sir Hector Malden, who had come to an examination and found a reckoning, looked a long time at the 2 readings and the notebook and the paper in the candle, and then said, in the flat voice of a man used to hard duties, that the board would receive Mr. Finch's evidence and the accused man's own key at Candlemas, and that he did not think any board of honorable officers would send Major Lord Christopher Weir to a wall on a reading his own family had overturned with his own key, and that as to how a false certification came out of the king's cipher office on the household paper of the very family concerned, that was a matter the superintendent should explain to persons a great deal less friendly than himself. And Silas Renwick, too clever to bluster and too clever to run, and out at last of the third cold thing, was not in the room to hear it. Because a found-out man feels the wind before it blows, he had drawn his wages from the estate office 2 days before and taken the London mail, and was on a packet out of Harwich before the examination ever sat, and he never stood his trial, and he never felt a rope. And that is the one dissatisfaction in the whole business, and I will not pretend to you otherwise, because the stories that give you the villain in irons at the end are lying to make you feel better. He was beaten, and he was not punished. He lost his plunder and his place and kept his neck, and ended somewhere warm across the water on money nobody could trace. And the man who owned his debts, the real traitor the whole forgery had been built to save, was never certainly named at all. That is the truth. But the boy was saved. That is the thing that was real. Major Lord Christopher Weir stood before the board of general officers at Candlemas with his own key in evidence and old Finch's oath behind it and his own honest warning read out in the room. And the board did not send him to a wall. It cleared him, wholly, and the clearing was gazetted. And the 400 men in the sunken lane were written at last into the histories, as men their own comrade had died trying to save. And late on the night the word came down from London that the Gazette would clear him, when the Dowager had been carried up to bed in a triumph that would keep her alive out of spite for another 3 years, and the house was quiet. The Duke of Alderwick went down alone to his book room with a single candle, to the table where he had turned his brother's key with his own hand, and he sent a servant up to the west wing to ask, very humbly, whether Miss Clave would come, because he could not make himself believe, even now, even with his brother saved, how near he had come to losing everything to a man he trusted, and a truth he had turned out into the rain, and he wanted to hear it once more, in order, from the only person in the whole affair who had never once got it wrong. And Rosamond came at 2 in the morning in her cloak, and stood in the book room across the candle from him, and told him a 4th time how it had been done. Not the arithmetic this time, but the shape of it. How a smooth man had read a true warning backwards into a false betrayal, and how a letter turned inside out could be turned right side in again by anyone honest enough to use the real key. And the Duke listened with the flame between them, and at the end he said, "In November you stood in my study and told me my brother was being murdered on paper, and I told you to leave the ciphers to the Admiralty men, and you made your curtsy to my shoulder and went out into the dark. I have thought about my own shoulder every day since I turned that key with my own hand. I owe you an apology of a size I do not know how to make, and I find I have not the time to make it properly, because I have discovered that I do not want to spend another season anywhere you are not, and I would rather say that badly to you tonight, here, over a candle, among the papers you saved, than beautifully next year when the whole county has decided what you are." She knew what was coming. She had known, she thought, since he first turned in his chair in the blaze of that room and looked at her instead of at his own certainty. And she did the thing she had promised herself she would do if it ever came, which was to name the cost aloud before she named anything else, so that he should never think she had not counted it. "There are people in this county," she said, "who spent this winter saying I was mad, and a great many more who will spend the spring saying I was clever, that the governess ciphered her way out of the schoolroom and into a duchess's chair, that the whole of it my father's trade, and the notebook and the watermark, was only a long, shrewd courtship dressed up as a rescue. They will say it about my dead father's honest name, and about mine, and they will say it the louder the higher I go, and they will say it for the rest of my life. I have spent this whole winter being called mad, Your Grace, and I found I could bear it. I am telling you now, before I answer, that I have counted the cost of being called clever too, because it is the higher price, and I will not have you think I did not see the bill. I watched you read the bill, said the Duke, the night old Finch stood up and spent his 40 years to save my brother, and you did not smile once, because you knew what it cost him. Name me the price of you, and I will pay my half in the open, in front of the whole county, for as long as they care to send it in. Marry me, Rosamond. I will spend the rest of my life being the Duke who was wrong at the window, if you will spend it being the woman who was right in the dark, and let the county make of the pair of us exactly what it likes. And Rosamond Clave, 25, a decipherer's orphan with ink worn into her second finger, standing over a candle among the papers she had saved, found that the thing she had thought she would have to weigh for a week weighed nothing at all once it was actually in her palm, and she said, "Then I will want it written down, Your Grace, and witnessed and proved twice, the way my father taught me, for a thing said once is only a rumor, and I have had a bellyful this winter of things that were only said." They were married at Alderwick the week after Easter, and Major Lord Christopher Weir, cleared and gazetted and thin from his bad autumn, stood up beside his brother and gave the bride away himself, saying he owed her the only thing he had left to give, which was his own good name to hand her across, and the Dowager Duchess Cordelia came down for it in black silk and outlived the wedding by 3 years out of what she plainly regarded as spite well spent. And old Obadiah Finch came, and wept, which he had not done since Josiah Clave's funeral, and told the bride her father would have known the reading was hers by the beauty of it. And Rosamond, who became a duchess but never once stopped being a decipherer's daughter, asked for 3 things at her own wedding feast, and not one of them was for herself. She asked that the true history of the sunken lane be set down and lodged where the families of the 400 could read it, so that no widow of that place should go to her grave thinking her man died for a trader's sale instead of despite a comrade's warning. She asked that the false certification and the manner of its undoing be laid before the king's cipher office as a lesson, so that no office should ever again set its seal on a reading without turning the accused man's own key first, and that honest Mr. Finch's method be written into their practice under his own name. And she asked, last, and this was the one her voice was not quite steady on, that it be recorded somewhere the world could read it that Josiah Clave, decipherer of 3 narrow rooms behind the General Post Office, had been the best natural hand the branch ever had, and had taught his daughter everything she knew, so that the next quiet, honest servant the crown wore out unthanked in the dark might know that the work had been seen, in the end, and had saved a man's life. It was all written down, and witnessed, and it is lodged still, and the sunken lane paper is read at that place every year on the day of the battle, the true history in a plain voice. Because a duchess, who had once had to make her curtsy to the shoulder of a duke, made very sure that this time the true reading was set down where nobody clever could ever turn it inside out again. So I keep thinking about that first night in the study, the warm fire, the 2 smooth gentlemen from the War Office, and a young woman standing in the middle of a cold, grand room, with the proof of an innocent man's life held flat against her cloak, being told to leave the ciphers to the Admiralty men, while the chief cipher in the house stood at the mantel with his forgery already sold, because that is where it ends for nearly everybody, isn't it? She had the truth in her arms in that room, and the truth was shown the door, and it did not begin to win until an old woman remembered a box, and a duke turned a key with his own hand, and an old spymaster spent his last certainty to be honest instead of safe. So tell me which one you would have been. In that study or at that table, the one who stands up when the whole warm room has already agreed on the tidy answer and reads the true message anyway, or the one who keeps the book, quietly in the cold until the day it cannot be argued with. Both of them are in this story, and they are the same woman, and only one of them was ever thanked. Next time I will tell you about a lady's companion who was handed a locked music room and told the harpsichord in it had not been tuned since a death in the family, and who lifted the lid and found a name written inside the case in a hand she knew, and a secret the whole great house had been keeping from its own heir, and I would dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. So leave the name of your town in the comments, and I will read them out. A single candle in a great book room at 2 a.m. A worn soldier's notebook open on the table. A sheet of paper held up to the flame, and in the grain of it a maker's mark and a year, plain as a brand, and no sound in the room at all but the fire, and the frost ticking in the tall, dark panes, and, far off in the house, an old woman sleeping at last in the certainty that her family would go on.